I know you mentioned this in our introduction, but this topic isn't really discussed in schools. And with EYEJ, we start with this conversation as early as 6th grade. I think it's valuable, any student, to have a foundation and a space to talk about this. They may not be getting it at home. They may not have the people in their lives that themselves know how to utilize money and become financially independent. So it's incredibly important to create the space to not only teach them foundations, but have a space to ask those questions. One thing that we really utilize is we go through an actual budget, and we talk about the definitions and the language around money. And we've seen students really be able to utilize that outside of our sessions and apply that to their everyday life.
The biggest thing is kind of difficult with the different educational mandates, especially in the, not even just across the country, but especially in the state of Ohio. So for example, we talk about financial literacy. There is a small portion of financial literacy in Ohio in the learning standards for social studies, but it's not really pushed. I know through the years they have told American history teachers and government teachers, we need you to teach this, but it hasn't been really pushed to be uniformity and to have it done with fidelity. There's a small portion in there that, as Katie stated, is not talked about a lot. Now, the thing about it with me, what I do is, so for example, I have a set of standards that I have to teach. And so, for example, we talk about communism, I get to talk about capitalism. And I begin to talk about entrepreneurship and things like that. And we start to talk about the free market, ownership. A lot of our students frequent this gas station across the street. And I say, well, that person can own as many gas stations as they want because we live in a capitalistic society. So that's one way. But another thing that I do is I look at the child's behavior financially. What are they buying with their own money? And then I can kind of start the conversation. If I see kids with a lot of candy, chips, a lot of the times, I often stop them in the hallway and say, okay, what you spent for that? Maybe you could have done this. You have to be very creative when you can't just have a whole class as you would like on financial literacy. So I often find different ways in the hallways in the classroom to steer the conversation toward financial literacy and ask different questions and give my own personal experiences. But you have to be very careful because it's difficult because they expect you to teach certain standards to prepare for a test. Another challenge is the history of maybe what the student may or may not have had. Have they been exposed to different spending habits, credit, debit, different things like that? You're challenged with what are they taught at home? And so what I do, I'm very sensitive to that, but I just ask questions and I look at where they are now and I challenge them. And then I try to give them as much education as possible with the very finite time that I do have to teach that portion.
So it's been a really cool experience speaking with these students on this topic. We talk about exploring money, but we also have topics around investing in your future, achieving a positive mindset, and they're really all interconnected. Lawrence, who's been a volunteer with EYEJ for several weeks now, has been able to be part of these conversations with these students for several weeks now, and we've been able to kind of see how they all connect. And I would love for Lawrence to comment in at all if he would like to. But yes, Arianna was supposed to join us today, and I'm going to speak a little bit about her experiences on behalf of her not being here today. But we have found that students their age aren't necessarily talking about those conversations externally. Arianna is in 6th grade. She's going into 7th grade. And she actually has a nail business. She started doing her nails when I first met her as a student. She texted me one day as we first were, developing our relationship. And she said, I need a business card. I said, a business card for what? And, she said, no, I do nails, $25 a set. And so I said, okay, let me show you how to use Canva and we can make this. And so it's interesting because I think some of these students are doing things, but they don't have the language and the knowledge to understand the impact that it can have on them long term if they, continue these habits and or don't continue them. And so for Arianna, yesterday we talked about investing in your future. And like I said, these conversations are very much connected. And we talked about how you have this idea. You're technically an entrepreneur. How can you invest in your future? What do you have to, investments, expenses that you can think about long-term in your nail business? And these are questions that, she's not being asked. She's not being thought to critically think like that. So I think, like I said, I think the majority of youth have some of these thoughts, but they don't have the language in the space to talk about it and to kind of understand the impact of it. And if Lawrence, if you want to add anything, you've been right alongside with me in all of these conversations.
I mean, the biggest thing is that I've learned from just the conversations. For one, Arianna is, to me, just side note, is not to me personally, the average sixth grader going to the seventh grader. I wish you was here that day if you ever talked to her and the way that she's thinking. I think the biggest thing is just exposure and giving these students exposure and answering their questions. Because for me, I've been in education a while, but to hear this young lady, she sounds more mature, but also knowledgeable and yearning for knowledge than some of my high school people. And that's not to, I'm just saying, it was just mind-boggling to talk to her. But just to expose and to basically what we have to do as support is to hear their ideas and kind of point them in the right direction. That's what they need. They kind of, some of them know what's in their minds, but to kind of point them in the right direction and get them formal, technical skills and abilities and even the right people to talk to. For me, I'm not the biggest one on business, but to get them to talk to the right people. That's about it.
So I think that, kind of to go along with what Katie and Lawrence were just saying. So I've done a lot of the speaker series before, and I think I've done Exploring Money probably more than any of them, probably 4 or 5 times or so, and over the last 3 years, or whatever it may be. And one of the things that Katie and Lawrence, you guys are just talking about, like, really how do some of these kids see money, and how do they see themselves as entrepreneurs, or where do they think money comes from? I know one of the questions that we ask all the time is when we're sitting in front of the kids is how are you going to get money? And 9 times out of 10 it was they're going to play professional ball, whether it's basketball or football, and so several times we've kind of broken that down. So let's talk about LeBron, for instance. Clearly he has a lot of money. Where does his money come from? And the kids are always surprised to see that a much larger percentage of his money comes from his business ventures as opposed to his actual salary from playing basketball, and how smart he's been with his money over the years. And so I think kind of education and just getting them to understand exactly where money comes from, how it's earned, how it grows, I think that's really the key. We were having a conversation in one of the CMSD schools, I don't know when it was, last year or the year before, and it was 6th graders. And believe it or not, we started talking about stocks. Lawrence talked a little bit about capitalism earlier and kind of explaining to them, again, how money grows. And we asked them what your favorite brands were. I think someone said Nike and someone else said Apple. And then we kind of explained to them that you can actually own a piece of Nike or own a piece of Apple. So, sure, you could take $150 and you can spend it on a new pair of LeBrons, or you could take that same amount of money and buy a share of Nike stock. And while all of their friends keep buying new shoes and new sneakers, new LeBrons, that just means that share of stock you have that was once worth 1 pair of shoes is now worth 2 pairs of shoes. But we talked very, very high level about kind of how stocks work and how spending a little bit of money up front can yield some pretty big results down the road. Again, these are 6th graders, so it was very, kind of at a small level, but it was really interesting to kind of see the gears in their head start to turn. I think at a much more micro level, I think it's kind of taking money out of money. What I mean by that is really talking about the differences between needs and desires. So going back to the Nike example, I guess, so talking about what else that $150 could have bought, right? What's the purchasing power, the buying power of a pair of shoes, for example. So I think to have a healthy relationship with money, kids really have to have an understanding of what it is, of where it comes from, how they can get it, and how they can get it legally. That was a big part of what we would talk about. What's really interesting about being in the room with these kids is, it's really a conversation. It's not us just sitting there talking to them and explaining to them how the world works. They know how the world works. They live in it. So it's really getting their understanding of how their world really works. And a lot of them express that they want to be able to get money in ways that don't have to do with doing illegal things. That nail thing, the nail business, that's awesome for a sixth grader. That's unbelievable. A lot of the kids that they would go, they'd go to the store and they'd buy, 24-pack of water, and then they'd go and sell the individual, bottles on, on the streets and whatever that may be, like, to the cars that are going by, and they'd make a lot of money that way. And it really showed them how they can then take those proceeds and make it into a bigger thing. So it was kind of neat, again, seeing their gears working, but you kind of have to focus them and get them to really understand, to Lawrence's point, how they can do that, even at a young age. Right?
And I'd love to add something to that. I think Michael really nailed it when he said understanding their relationship with money. And, Arianna is definitely a student that stands out to us, but the majority of the students that we serve, the needs versus the wants is incredibly difficult, and it looks a lot different to them than it may look to me. And so it's valuable to keep note that these students are acting out of survival, and so recognizing where their money needs to go to them, it looks a lot different, especially if that's how they've lived their whole life, and that's how their role models utilize money for survival, to have enough food on the table. And so I think that value and that component of understanding the needs versus wants and what long-term wealth can look like and how they can start building that and breaking those cycles is incredibly valuable.
I believe it's everything. And let me say this, I still need direction now. And I'm pretty sure Michael, if I had some financial questions, he could probably tell me stuff I don't know now. And that's serious. You need direction, exposure, education, everything. A lot of my mistakes were based on ignorance, lack of knowledge. I accrued a lot of financial debt in terms of just because I didn't know. And I was just kind of spinning my wheels and doing things. So it is extremely important. And I think the best thing to do is to don't assume that they already know, but to approach everybody sensitively that they don't know and give them the information that they need. But I think we talked about it before is how they see money. I think it's extremely important not to just talk to them and talk at them, but how do they see money? And then you connect with them by saying, okay, I'm taking your foundation, and now we're going to work on where you can go to be successful. Financial independence. For example, real quickly, I often ask young adults, we know what their interests are, not all of them. They love, a lot of the young adults that I interact with love cars. I say, okay, one day you're going to want a certain type of car. How do you think you're going to be able to get that car? And we talk about it. And I said, you know what, unless you're just rich, you're going to probably have to go into a dealership. You probably have to have some, what they said. And I said, you're going to have some credit problem. You got to talk down payment. So we get to talk about that stuff. And some of them do, and some of them don't know. So it's the fact of steering them it's so important, because many struggle for lack of knowledge. I do. I didn't know a lot of things. I just bought a home recently, but it's some things I had to learn prior to. I bought a home last year. I had to learn prior to that, even that as an adult, that I didn't know. So if I'm an adult and I don't know, what are some of them either exposed to or not exposed to? Are they exposed to predatory lending? Different. You understand? You know that there's a lot of, in our neighborhoods. Let's just be honest. There's a lot of check cashing. Let's just be honest with each other. I'm from East Cleveland, Ohio, where I teach.
Yeah.
So they have to have direction. And guess what? If I don't know, I go ask somebody who will know to help the students out.
Yeah, I think Michael kind of talked a little bit about this, to access to money and access to banks. And so I think when it comes to generational wealth, and I'm not exactly sure if this statistic's exactly right, but I think it takes something like 3 generations for a family to change generational gaps, whether that's low, middle, or high income. And it's much easier for middle class to drop down to lower and vice versa versus middle class going to upper. And so that comes down to what are these opportunities that families are having to gain wealth, and not money that is for survival, not money that goes away in X amount of days and they're just cutting their bills. And so, a big part of empowering young people is to develop a mindset of entrepreneurship, developing a mindset of being creative, and how they can create wealth and not just short-term wealth. And I think it's important to acknowledge that race has definitely played a role in generational wealth. I mean, when we talk about redlining and banks being able to provide or not provide loans based on race, I mean, that's still impacting communities and families today. Because of course, families that weren't able to get loans 50, 60, 70 years ago made it more difficult for them to gain wealth. And so that's going to impact their children and their grandchildren that are currently living today. So I think it's important to still note that generational wealth is impacted by laws that used to exist, and that it makes it difficult even today for students, and especially the students that we serve, to think about wealth in a way in which can break those cycles and can start gaining that wealth and sustainability over time.
So I work for the Key Private Bank, and my entire job essentially is managing generational wealth. So it's making sure that folks and families that have been fortunate enough to have a whole lot of money can pass that along to the next generation. And I often tell people that I work with that, well, we're going to have a very good relationship. It's really the next generation, and so your kids and grandkids that are really going to appreciate the things that we do. So it's difficult for people who are second, third, fourth generation, or even to Katie's point, it's difficult for people who grew up middle class, who are now upper class, to hang on to family wealth over the course of 1, 2, 3 generations. So imagine how hard it is for somebody coming from lower class who has somehow made it to hang on to that as well. I mean, you don't have to look any further than just looking at, countless stories of athletes who have, not even within one generation, but within a career, have blown most of their money. So it's there's a conversation that has to happen, and something that we do with a lot of our larger families is really sit down and talk to the next generation without talking about how much money they have. But we really want them to understand what it means to kind of carry on the legacy of that family, right? So it's, the McLoughlin family. What does that mean to be a McLoughlin? What does that actually entail? And that's from philanthropy and how they live their life and how they spend their money. So it's an interesting conversation that we have. And again, it's difficult enough just to have that with people who are used to having money. It is an entirely different situation with people who it is brand new to them. And a lot of that goes to your next question, which is kind of good debt and bad debt, and what does that actually mean? I think we've all mentioned this over the course of this talk so far, kind of the needs and desires. And that's kind of what good debt and bad debt is. So essentially, good debt is debt that you're going to use to purchase something that's a need. Oftentimes it's something that's going to appreciate in value. It's going to go up in value. Not always, but usually. So a mortgage is a good example of that. If you use a mortgage to buy a home, that's good debt. More often than not always, but more often than not, the value of that home is going to go up over the course of your ownership of it. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You know, a car loan, if you need a car to get to work and you have to take on debt to get that car is not going to be worth more than when you bought it. It's going to be worth less, but that's still good debt because that's something that's going to help you get to your job and kind of move on in life. Student loans within reason are generally considered good debt. You know, education, unlike a home, a car, really anything else that you purchase, education is the absolute only thing that I can think of that once you have can never be taken away from you. Literally ever. You have it for life. That's generally good debt, depending on how you use it. Bad debt would be credit card bills. So, you know, if you need to rack up a little bit of debt to buy groceries, okay, that's fine. But if you're racking up that debt because you spent the money that you should have spent on groceries on something that was a want and not a need, then that would be bad debt. When you use credit cards to purchase things that are simply a want, then you know the value of that thing goes down. That's bad debt. Not to mention, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but bad debt is much more expensive. In other words, you're going to be charged a lot more to use that money. Yeah, so you know, I just mentioned how student loans are good debt, and I still think that's true. But it's important to understand kind of the ROI, the return on the investment. So what is that degree going to get you? I think that's a crucial question. So if you're graduating college with $30,000 in debt, the degree that you got, which allows you to get the job that you're going to get, better give you an opportunity to earn enough money to pay back that $30,000 in a reasonable amount of time, and that payback isn't going to hurt you and take away from, you know, the other needs that you have. I think there's a few ways around this. I think that there's a whole nother, I mean, we could talk for 5 hours just about maybe regulations and things that maybe need to happen on Capitol Hill. But for what we can do today in our lives, you mentioned private and federal loans. So I think trying to stick to federal loans as much as possible. They tend to be a little bit lower interest rates. They're more forgivable as well. So depending on your situation and the career path you take, you mentioned teachers. So oftentimes there are some loans that will be for a little bit forgivable if you teach in under marginalized communities. I mean, there's certain ways that you can go about getting kind of better loans. Another really good way, and we see this a lot, you know, instead of enrolling in a 4-year college right away, you take classes at a community college like Tri-C here in Cleveland. You do that for a couple of years. It's significantly less expensive. You then transfer to a 4-year college to earn your degree and finish up graduation. Nobody knows the difference. Your diploma looks exactly the same as everyone else's. You just have less debt, which is always nice. You asked a little bit about how holding on to that debt throughout adulthood can impact people. I think a lot. So there's something called the time value of money. So essentially, $1 today, intelligently invested, I guess you would have to say, but $1 today should be worth more tomorrow if you do the right things with it. So let's say you owe $30,000. That's going to take you 15, 20 years to pay back, depending on the program you're with. You know, you're paying $300, $400, $500 a month on that. You know, if having that extra, let's call it $300 a month laying around, causes you to have to use a credit card to pay for the needs, not the wants, but the needs, then you're actually paying interest on that $300 twice. You're paying it because you took it out for student loans, and now you're paying it again because you have to borrow more of that, and you've been at a higher interest rate as well. So I think the less amount of debt, and this goes for not just student loan debt, but debt in general, can really impact your future more than I think people really understand or realize.
Got it. Another one of the questions, and I'll maybe just kind of open this up if anybody has any thoughts or feels comfortable talking about it. Personally, I really don't have any like insider thoughts into this, but I think it's Caitlin White who says it could be beneficial to discuss financial desperation or lack of financial opportunities for marginalized individuals who are more likely to be recruited into sex trafficking situations, or probably certainly we could kind of explore things like prostitution or just drugs and making money illegally. Be curious if anyone has any kind of thoughts just around that topic in general. discussing the financial desperation and lack of financial opportunities. I hope that some of the stuff we've talked about today can kind of like point people in the right direction, but don't want to be ignorant to trying to have you guys share any thoughts. Lawrence, Katie, Michael, anything on that?
I think that in regards to financial opportunities for marginalized individuals, I think the reality is there's still, oppression that individuals face in job discrimination, that individuals face in marginalized communities. I think we have to recognize that to be able to move forward from it. Of course, that's part of what the entire movement, just one part of the entire movement of Black Lives Matter, that's happening right now. And so I think we have to understand that there's still lack of opportunity. There are still students and there's still marginalized communities, especially the students that we serve, that aren't going to have equal opportunity. And so when we talk to students about that, we can't beat around the bush, in the sense, like that is something that they know themselves, whether they've have been discriminated personally or seen their parents be discriminated, or maybe they haven't had the conversation, but it exists. And so I think we still need to be talking about that. I mean, exploring money and having all these opportunities to gain knowledge and create space is great. It's awesome, but it still comes down to the fact that when these students go into the world, they're going to face discrimination, it's unfortunate. And from marginalized individuals that may be pressured into other areas such as gang recruitment, because that's the way they can make money. Like Michael said earlier about how do we talk to these students about gaining wealth in a legal and safe way. And so that's a whole nother battle, and it still needs to be talked about now, because it's truth. And I think when it comes back to survival, Arianna stands out to us. For being sixth grade and being an entrepreneur, it's great. But then we ask her, okay, so where does your money go? How are you investing it in your future? How are you thinking about, generational wealth? And she's like, oh, well, the majority of my money goes to my mom because she needs it. Helps with rent, helps with my little brother. So that's, this is why the cycle of discrimination and the cycle of oppression in regards to wealth is still a problem, so yeah, she's on the right path. Yeah, she's thinking in the right way, but then her money has to go to her mom. So it's something to consider, and it's something that has to still be addressed. I appreciate Caitlin for bringing it up. I think it's the reality of what the majority of our students face every day.
One of the other questions from Rosalind, she says, I have 6 nieces and nephews. They range from 2 to 20 years old. And what can I do at home to serve as a mentor to them? I'm not a financial expert, but I do want to be a good example to them in any way that I can. Does anyone on the panel have any suggestions about what Rosalind can do?
I was going to say something. I think Mike could probably answer that a little, bit better right there.
Well, I mean, I think there's things that we all can do when around kids dealing with money. So, I think one of the important things is if you're shopping with kids, it's making them understand kind of the value of things. And 2 to 20 is a pretty big range. So that upper half of that range, you can really explain it with money. That lower half of the range, sometimes, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but taking the money out of money. So it's about the value of things. So if they really want, Lauren spoke earlier about candy and chips and things like that. So, if a bag of candy is $1, what else could you do with that $1? Or if you really want the big bag of chips and that costs $1.50 and all you have is $1, it's about explaining, well, maybe if you just wait a week, you'll have more, a couple of days, and you'll have more, you'll be able to buy that. So I think it's less about, what the value of the actual dollar that you're holding is, and more about setting the good example of really how it is related to other things. Everything's relative. in the world. You know, or even if you're shopping, let's take food out of it, you know, you're at the store and you see a shirt that you really want, and really talking through your reasoning for maybe not buying something or buying something with the kids that are around you. Oh, you know, I really like this shirt. You know, I'm going to start saving a little bit of my money so that maybe in a month or two, I can buy this without having to take, I can buy this want without having to take away from my needs. Or the other way around, I've been saving, so now I have the money that I can actually purchase this for. I think it's less about talking and more about just showing and setting that good example.
I think that's a good question, but I think it's just like Michael said, it's about action first. You know what I mean? Yeah, you're going to have dialogue, but enter them into your financial life if you can. And if you're going to the grocery store, take them with you. I mean, take them with you and show them, I have a list. This is what I'm going to spend. And this is the type of products that I buy. So they can visually see what she's doing. And a lot of times in education, you get a lot of people say, we want the kids to be hands-on. We want hands-on. So you want to give them the hands-on training, but also, you know, what you have to do is be honest with them about money. You know, maybe some of your mistakes that you made, you know, to just really tell them, but also show them. One example that I give, I have a nephew who's 9, and my sister started giving him an allowance. My mother, that's her only grandchild, so she spoils him. But what she did is put a whole plan together for my 9-year-old nephew. I looked at it. She's retired, so she has time on her hands. She put a whole plan together of things that he needs to do. It's a calendar and what the money he can make per week. I saw it. I'm like, wow. So this past Sunday, she came to my home and she bought him an electronic piggy bank to where he puts his own code in, and there's he can put, when he gets money, he can just put it up there and it takes the money. So we're starting him off. That's something as simple as, hey, if you do this, if you do this by the end of the week, I'll give you this. But then you have a piggy bank and you can put your money. So we started at 9 with the concept of saving money. That's something so practical that most people can do. It doesn't take financial expertise, because I'm not that. It just telling them the practical truth that what you know about money. That's what I would say.
And I think just to add to that, you know, when we talk about this topic with our students, we go through an entire budget. So we together did income, expenses. What are your needs? So what are your monthly payments that aren't going to change? What are the payments that will change? And so we talked them through it. We inputted it all. We did the math together. And in the past, when we've done this with students and we've given them these budgets, they've gone home and been able to sit down with their parents and do things like this and come back to us and said, hey, look, this month I've saved this amount of money, and like now I understand how am I spending and why every time I make money from my job at the library, it seems that at the end of the month I don't have as much money because now I see where it's going. So I mean, we've been doing this topic for several years, and it's been incredible to see the students actually come back to us with these testimonies around how talking and having the language, and like both Michael and Lawrence alluded to, really going through a budget with a student can benefit them long term.
Yeah, it's amazing when we talk to them about budgeting, and I'm glad you brought that up, Katie. The relative cost of things was completely foreign to them. So you'd go through the exercise. We were saying, you know, how much is rent or mortgage? Okay, then how much do you think your family spends on food a month? How much? And while, you know, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, they understand the concept of money, they have no idea, for the most part, especially the folks that we're talking to, how they relate to each other. So how much is going towards that? How much is going towards food? And so, budgeting is huge. And a lot of times they don't have those expenses at that age. So especially, again, you're talking 2 to 20, right? So that's a big age range. But especially for the younger kids, kind of in that middle group, just really talking to them about the budget that you do, and so that they understand where all of that money goes. Because a lot of times I think kids, especially younger ones, just assume money comes from wherever, and mom and dad, and aunt and uncle, grandma, grandpa. We just kind of spend it, and then things just show up. And so I think it's really breaking down where, either on a pie chart, which is very nice and visual, as to which percentage of the money is going to where. I think that really kind of opens their eyes a little bit to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I think two things. One, it's exposure, like Lauren said. But I think what ties into exposure is exposure and opportunity for marginalized students.
Yep,
That's
yep.
a whole lot different than exposure and opportunity for the rest of the population. So how can we strategically implement these aspects of exploring money to a population that is disadvantaged and lacks trust in the system of creating wealth?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think building up trust is so important. I think it was Katie, I think you mentioned redlining earlier, and while that hasn't been an official practice, obviously, for many years, 50, 60, 70 years, it is something that carries on even to today. No doubt about it, it has definitely created communities that are marginalized, and has created a more difficult situation for people that if they didn't have those problems, if their great-great-grandparents didn't have those issues, they would not be in the situation they're in. So I think that money lending institutions and banks have made a lot of progress over the past 20 years, let's say, to move into those marginalized communities and try to bridge that gap. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to happen. But I work for several large institutions, and I've seen what they're doing, and it makes me hopeful for the future. Again, a long way to go still, but really it's building that bridge and making people understand that that there needs to be a trust there between the two groups.
I would just say education, because and we can't, and I don't think we're not being cliche. We understand that we have an issue. Nobody's hiding that. Generational poverty is extremely real. We talked about generational wealth. Generational poverty is extremely systemic, and it's real, and sometimes people will perpetuate what they've been around. I would say to make it simple, and let me say this real quickly. David Ramsey is not the only person you can listen to. That's for me. That's my opinion. There's so many other people can listen to and find out about. Let me say that. I don't want to think that that's the only person. But one of the things I learned from him is money is mostly about behavior also. So if I say I want to help our communities out, and I say I'm going to give this money, if you're bad with $5, you're going to be bad with $5 million, so to speak. So behavior is everything. And I want to say this. I would want one day to have a massive financial literacy curriculum, massive, not what the little they have now, because somebody could say, well, they have those standards in the state of Ohio. No, I'm talking about massive, where it is loud, where it is uniform across this whole state, especially in urban communities, but for everybody, so we can at least expose them to what, even if they don't think they need the class, this is what we're going to do. And that's what I would say.